Chapter 45. Suspicion turned to certainty in the eyes of Talish, the Tuolagi thief, as he glanced up and saw Will hanging from the watchtower framework, his longbow and quiver slung over one shoulder. The Tuolagi didn't recognize the young man, but he recognized the weapons. He had seen bows like that before, when he and his friends had charged the Aridi campsite. "He's one of the foreigners," he yelled, drawing his sword. "Get him!" His two henchmen moved forward with him, their own swords ringing clear of their scabbards. Alum stepped clear of the wall, discarding his cloak and drawing his own weapon to bar their way. "Keep going, Will," he called. "I'll take care of them." But there were 3 of them, all seasoned fighters, and they crowded upon him, swords flashing, rising and falling as they attacked. Alum gave ground stubbornly before them, but he was fighting a losing battle. He set his back to the stones of the wall and desperately parried the storm of blows that rained upon him. Inevitably, one of the swords broke through his defense, and he was cut badly on the upper part of his sword arm. Then another stroke slashed across his thigh and he stumbled, recovering just in time to avoid a horizontal slash at his throat. Hanging awkwardly above him, there was no way Will could unsling his bow in time to help. Even if he could have done so, he couldn't have shot, hanging by his arms. Yet he could see his friend would be dead within a few seconds. Alum's parries were growing clumsy and awkward now, and he was cut again, this time across the forehead, so that blood ran into his eyes, half blinding him. From the square, Will heard the crowd's chanting grow louder and louder, faster and faster. "Hassan! Hassan! Hassan!" The cry came from hundreds of throats and rolled across the town like thunder, waking echoes in the gullies and mountains around them. Will hesitated for a second. Alum would die if he didn't help him. But the chanting of the crowd told him that events in the square were building to a climax. Holt needed him. But Alum was here and now, and fighting desperately to save him. There was no question about what he should do. Measuring the distance, he released his grip and let himself drop to the uneven battle below him. He landed feet first on the shoulders of the Tuolagi leader. The man gave a cry of shock and pain and crumpled beneath the force of Will's body dropping on him from 4 meters above. Will heard the snap of bones breaking somewhere, then a sickening thud as the bandit's head slammed into the hard, rocky ground. Will rolled forward to cushion the shock of landing, although the greater part of the force of his fall had been broken by the Tuolagi's body. He leapt to his feet as the other 2 bandits turned on him. Shocked by his unexpected action, they hesitated a second, and that was a second too long. Will stepped into them, closing the distance between him and them so that he was inside the reach of the nearest man's sword. Always move forward if you have the option. Holt had drummed the lesson into his brain hundreds of times. A man going forward has the momentum to control a battle. Now Will acted spontaneously, stepping forward. The sax knife hissed out of its scabbard as he drew and lunged in one smooth, continuous movement, taking the closest man in the center of the body. The Tuolagi gave a short cry, half surprise, half pain, and sank back against the wall, his sword dropping from his hand and clanging against the stones. From the square, Will heard a deafening cheer. Then the ringing cry came again as the crowd chanted Hassan's name. Then there was a sudden silence. He didn't like the sound of that. Time was getting short, and there was still one Tuolagi to take care of. As Will had dropped from the tower onto the shoulder of the first bandit, Alum had sunk gratefully back against the wall, trying to staunch the flow of blood from multiple sword cuts to his arm, leg, and body. He watched as the young ranger took care of 2 of his opponents in a matter of seconds, saw the third Tuolagi was within reach now, and tried to lend a hand. Coming to his knees, he slashed at the bandit, but his stroke was weak and poorly coordinated. The Tuolagi saw it coming and parried it easily, sending Alum's sword spinning away out of his grip. Then he raised his own sword to finish off the Aridi. He was an experienced fighter, and he judged he had time for one quick killing stroke before he must turn and face the foreigner. Will threw the sax underhand, following through to the target automatically, in a movement that had been drilled into him over and over again in the past 5 years. The Tuolagi, arm raised for the killing stroke, was totally defenseless as the sax knife flashed across the distance separating him from Will. He felt a heavy impact in his side, an impact that staggered him. Then a huge pain flamed up around the point of impact, and he wondered what it... Then nothing. Will started towards Alum, then he stopped. From the square, voices were calling again. Initially, they were single voices, but then more and more joined together. He frowned, managing to make out the words. "Release her! Release her!" He realized it must be about Evelyn, and for a moment felt a surge of hope. They were going to release his friends. Then Usal's hard, uncompromising tones cut across the voices of the crowd. "That's enough! Enough!" The crowd fell silent. Alum, face screwed up in pain, gestured weakly for Will to climb back up to the watchtower. "Go, go! Hurry, there's no time!" He coughed, and scarlet blood stained the front of his robe. But he continued to point to the watchtower, and Will realized he was right. He could tend to Alum later, but now he had to rescue his friends and signal Umar to bring the rest of his men to the attack. Heedless of the rotting wood that groaned and splintered beneath his movements, he scrambled up the tower. Whereas before he had moved slowly and carefully, this time he moved at lightning speed, reasoning that the less time he put his weight on a hand or a foothold, the less chance there would be that it might collapse beneath him. Several beams, in fact, splintered and shattered after he had stepped clear of them and onto the next. The pieces clattered to the ground below. "Kill him now!" He heard Usal's shouted order, and he knew, somehow, that he was talking about Holt. Then he was on the relatively solid footing of the tower platform. He shrugged the bow off his shoulder into his left hand. His right hand automatically sought an arrow from the quiver, had it knocked on the bowstring before he was even aware of performing the action. From his vantage point, he could see across the low, flat-roofed houses of this section of the town to the square. Beyond the milling heads of several hundred spectators, Holt was being dragged forward and forced to kneel beside the executioner's block. His companions stood in a line behind him. Usal stood to one side, a grim figure with his dark robes and veiled face. On the other side was a monster. A giant Tuolagi, bare to the waist, head and face covered. Hugely muscled, gleaming with oil, holding an immense sword in 2 hands. The executioner. Hassan, Will realized. He saw Holt kneel, then turn and say something to Gillen, saw Usal gesture, and 2 men step forward to twist Holt's face back to face the front. The executioner stepped forward. The sword began to go up over his head. Will drew the arrow back until the tip of his right forefinger touched the corner of his mouth. His mind and senses analysed the shooting situation in fractions of a second. Range, a little over 120 metres. The arrow tip raised slightly in his sighting picture. Wind, nothing to worry about. The executioner was almost at full stretch now, measuring his stroke before the sword started down. Will knew this shot had to be right. There would be no time for a second attempt. He shrugged away the confidence-sapping uncertainty that followed the thought. Worry that you might miss a shot, and you almost certainly will, Holt had taught him. He heard the long sigh of expectation from the crowd, emptied his mind of worry and uncertainty, and allowed the bowstring to slide free of his fingers, almost of its own volition, sending the arrow on its way.